But only by one.
Yeah.
Only two.
Oh, thank you. Okay, let's do that there.
It's a live stream for all the USU videos.
Okay. You can see the table. I can move it closer. Can you see? I want to make sure I can hashtag here. Oh yeah, that would be so hashtag awkward. Okay, that's it.
Mark Lottery says you're a queen for live streaming the debate.
Hashtag slay.
What's Mark Lottery doing?
Okay.
He's watching the live stream.
Oh yeah.
If you hear like a knock and the phone's knocked down,
And knock it down.
just knock it down for me.
Yeah. Good day. Just put social media on data. Just put things on data. Sorry? Yeah. It's so good to see Macquarie in here. We've got to chant that when he stands up.
We've been informed we're going to be debating the Japan nationals as we go. What? Okay, and up.
Full circle bottom.
What motion is that?
The one about Philippines.
Okay. Without any further ado, we'd like to invite the first after the floor.
The push from side affirmative in this debate is incredibly simple. It is that this policy is the best way for the LDP to win election. MNCs have a disproportionate influence over government in Japan. Companies are desperate for workers because they are being outcompeted. They are crying out for an increase in the labour force, and this is simply the only way to appease them. But in addition to this is just a popular policy among citizens in Japan. Japanese people care deeply about nationalistic pride, and a failing economy is not one that they are proud of. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, 4-piece setup. Secondly, explaining why access to money will just win the LDP in the election. And finally, on why this is generally popular with the public. Firstly, 4-piece setup. First is an explanation that the LDP is a centre-right party, but note the fact that they are part of a larger coalition of broadly centre parties in Japan. Second of all, what kind of policies are we propping? 1, an increase in the ability to get a visa, noting that getting a visa in the status quo is incredibly difficult, so that is a significant change. Things like allowing the affordable housing policy Japan has to extend to immigrants, but also doing things like increasing the amount of uni placements through partnerships. Second of all, where do we think these people are coming from? We think 1, neighbouring Asian economies that have a hugely skilled labour force, places like South Korea, but also places like the USA and Canada. Thirdly, what kind of skills do we think Japan is looking for? 1, health workers, given that they are in an ageing population crisis and they need to fill this gap, but also things like engineers that can help out with the car companies on which their economy is so reliant. The businesses need wealthy people, these are the people we support. Note the fact panel that Japan has already been increasing the degree to which they support migration in the last few years. All we are supporting is an increase and an expedition in that policy that already exists. Note that under Abe in 2015 and 2016, those policies were supported by broader Abenomics. We note that it was a big part of the LDP's plan to increase their economic responsiveness and increase their GDP at that point. 2 pieces of substantive. Let's start with why we think this actually increases our money to actually win elections. A few parts of this argument. Firstly, why is it necessary? Second of all, why is it the best way to appease these type of companies? And finally, do we think why getting on board is essential to the LDP winning the election? Firstly, why do we think it's necessary? First thing to claim here is that the corporate lobbying power that these companies have in Japan is just massive. This panel, we're talking about companies like Hyundai and Nintendo and Sony and Mitsubishi and Panasonic. They are household names that are absolutely inherent to Japan's economy. Why do you think these companies have a disproportionate power in Japan than they do in places like Australia or the US or UK? 1, the US consolidation of the Japanese industry is a relic of the US occupation of Japan means that the way that they consolidate the Japanese industry to fight off communism just means that they have a disproportionate amount of control when it comes to lobbying. Second of all though, these companies are just empirically big, which means no matter what jurisdiction they're operating in, they do have a lot of power. But thirdly, we know that the constitution that started during the Cold War just means that businesses are inherently connected into political parties. We know that in Japan specifically, there are specific political delegates that focus on literally specific companies. So it's like you are assigned to a company as a political delegate. That proves that uniquely these companies have political power, which means 1, their support is essential because being able to be electorally successful is just dependent on this money. Noting the fact that the lobbying laws around electoral politics in Japan are very, very weak. So it's extremely hard to lock these people out. But second of all, we know that the LDP is not the only conservative party in Japan. They are open to competition. These companies will simply give their money to someone else if they don't give it to the LDP. Why do we think this is the best way to appease them? 3 things. 1, there are just chronic labour shortages in Japan, and if negative disagrees, they are literally lying. There is an ageing population in Japan that is making it incredibly difficult for these companies to compete. Second of all, COVID caused a huge amount of early retirement in Japan, and long COVID has meant that people have been suffering by health harms. But thirdly, internationally panel there has been labour shortages. That is also true in other places. But a lot of Japanese talent has flocked to the Western world, particularly Japan, because they are able, particularly the US, because they are able to pay them more. The impact of that is that businesses just are unable to operate properly under the status quo. They are screaming out for the government to assist them. They are offering super high wages because they are struggling to expand and struggling to compete. They cannot cope with the post-COVID demand that exists under the status quo. And this point explains to you why businesses' money, if it does not go to the LDP, will go to someone else that appeases them, will go to someone else who gives them the labours which they are desperately begging for. Finally, why do we think getting these companies on board is essential to the LDP winning the election? 3 things. 1, money. Think about how much money it costs to create successful political advertisements. They are the most important thing for the LDP to get elected. But second of all, being able to pay your staff is just essential, and this influx of money is crucial. Second of all, people in Japan are incredibly loyal to the companies by which they buy their products. That means that when companies propose a certain way or support a certain way, these individuals are likely to fall into that too. But thirdly, these companies have a huge amount of media lobbying power that is able to persuade people to vote for the LDP. Note the fact that for all this negative team wants to make arguments arguments perhaps about corporate capture and why it looks bad. 3 things why that's not important. First of all, this is a continuation of an existing policy that, despite the fact implicitly supports companies, is not an explicit company supporting policy. Second of all, we know the fact that always in Japan they engage in some form of corporate capture because that is just the way their political spectrum works. But thirdly, we know that people in Japan are incredibly loyal to their workplaces, which means that they likely would support this policy on a principled level anyway. The consequence of this is that even if this policy is unpopular amongst constituents, which I'm going to prove to you it's not, but even if it is, that argument is just not able to be defeated because it is the only way that they are going to be able to access the crucial amounts of money that they need to win this election. Companies care the most about filling skills shortages, and there is just no other mechanism to acquire those labourers than for this specific policy. So independent of the popularity of the policy, we must win on that account panel. Second of all, why do you think this will be generally popular within the Japanese public? And the first thing to note to here is that the Japanese spectrum in Japan is quite specific. So for example, the things that the right-wing party support are things like, one, military expansion, particularly, for example, allowing Japan to do things like a counter-strike. But second of all, things like nuclear energy, e.g. being able to release water from Fukushima. So that should know you that the Japanese spectrum is quite specific and it's highly nationalistic. So, why do you think the base of the LDP is conservative panel, but not anti-skilled immigrants? So any arguments they want to make about racism and how the LDP supporters are racist are going to be outweighed by these claims. Firstly, we think the type of immigrant that this policy would encourage to come to Japan are incredibly respectable. We're talking about wealthy people, we're talking about professionals, we're talking about white people from the Western world, not Eastern European people who are trying to take manual labour. We are talking about genuinely beneficial labourers that help the people who have the most amount of power. And second of all, we think that the average Japanese person cares deeply about economic nationalism. This comes in 2 parts. Firstly, they care about their elderly. Japan has a specific culture that cares about grandparents. People know without this labour, their grandparents will literally die sooner. They won't be able to be taken care of. There is no one to feed them each night. There is no one to clean them each night without these labourers that come in. Second of all, we know that the country's success of Japan more broadly is important to Japan. We point to the fact that Japan has expanded its childcare policies despite the fact that they're a deeply sexist country, which should make you believe that they care more about economic growth than they do about appeasing their particular sexist or racist idiosyncrasies. That means that, on net, we improve the economy because people do care about it. But also, note panel, Japan cares about turning around the humiliation that it suffered in the past. It cares about fixing the narrative that they're an aged country that's decrepit. They care about the post-real estate crisis and rebuilding that economy. They feel embarrassed this is the best way to do it. We seek to revoke this. No, after the assassination of Abenomics has become an obsession in Japan. They care about literally this is a policy that's consistent with Abenomics. It is something that is just consistent with everything that's been done in the past. It's not a new policy, it's an expansion of an existing policy. Never been proud to observe.
The central maxim of the LDP is to ask, what would Abe do? And panel, Abe would not listen to this team. 1 piece of setup, 1 piece of rebuttal, and then 3 arguments. First thing I want to note in the setup is what the likely alternative is for addressing some of the economic problems that this team claims there are. Because the answer is not to turn away from what Shinzo Abe himself set up. It's to continue those objectives and stand by them faithfully, as the LDP wants to do. It's things like pushing more natural childbirth within the country. It's stuff like pushing urbanization. So for instance, even the total population of Japan isn't growing. The productive urban centers are growing in a way that feeds economic growth. It's things like providing elderly assistance directly, rather than bringing in migrants who, as I will explain, are treated xenophobically to do it for you. And it's things like supporting automation, so there's less reliance on the sort of labour that this team would be likely to employ. So this isn't a trade-off between allowing Japan to fester and following this team. It's a trade-off between doing what Shinzo Abe himself has stood by, something the LDP wants to stand by, and going in a new direction which shapes the vote. The only piece of rebuttal I'm going to do before my substantive is undermine this team's claim that they're the side which wins over multinational corporations like Toyota and Hyundai, and that's necessary to win the debate. 3 responses. Firstly, this argument is not true. Japan is historically low inflation, low wage growth, which is not an indication that labour is in short supply. It's in fact an indication that skilled labour is incredibly high, widely supplied. And you know that because Japan's education system is extremely robust. The sort of brain-drain argument that this team runs directing people to the West might work in a country where labour opportunities are terrible, but Japan's labour opportunities are extremely desirable because of the exact constitutional entrenchment of companies into the government, which this team explains. People say there's no shortage of labour. But secondly, we point out the far more likely characterization is what is skilled labour going towards Japan. For the reason that the very people they say would be filling the currently filled, but for some reason need to be filled again, roles would be Koreans, would be Westerners, would be a range of other people who A, have no strong reason to move from a highly developed economy to another highly developed economy, B, have an active reason not to in the fact that their culture of Japan is directly oppositional to that of, for instance, my country, Korea, but also very different to places like the West. So just a total lack of mechanization. But secondly, this benefit is not exclusive. You can cater to companies in a range of other ways which do not shake the boat anywhere nearly as much. Stuff like lowering corporate taxes, stuff like producing policies which are favourable towards automation, stuff like pushing the urbanization which I described in my setup. But thirdly, this argument is not relevant because you can still do visas and uni placements, which is this team's version of the model, without increasing policies which encourage migration, which is a totally different question. This team misses the debate. But finally, this argument is far less important than the material I'll bring you in this speech, because donations don't win elections, votes do, and we'll explain why votes are the thing which this team loses. First argument on politics. This is incredibly unpopular because Japan is extremely xenophobic. 6 reasons why. The first reason is that Japan is substantially homogenous, definitely compared to places like the West, meaning there is less exposure to diversity, there's less exposure to cross-cultural dialogue, it's much harder to justify things like high migration. Secondly, historic low levels of immigration, meaning there are few success stories of migration, few societal narratives which exist within Japanese politics to explain why migration is productive and necessary. Thirdly, a nationalistic education system leads Japanese people to believe that their country is best on its own, that their country dominated Asia until the intervention of the West. They do not need other people, it should be Japan first. Fourthly, there's a lack of opportunities at the moment within Japan. That's why, for instance, you have such harsh labour conditions because of the race at the bottom that exists when so many people want jobs and so many people are qualified for them, but there aren't that many. Which means any version of this team's case, which is bring more people in to do those jobs, is going to be extremely unpopular because Japan's kind of labour utilisation rate is already so high and people are already very competing for those jobs. Fifthly, conservative media means that any friction, if these policies are implemented, that is, any one slight uptick in crime in the short term, any one instance of protests or riots, gets turned into a huge scandal for this team that they haven't been able to answer for. And finally, we point out, even if you think these things are changing, Japan changes extremely slowly. That's why, for instance, there are still strong norms of women remaining at home. That's why, for instance, business is still conducted in a way as if it is a respectful kind of pact between people, as opposed to an entirely corporate entity. Even if they say there are trends that might make their case make sense in 30 years, it certainly does not make sense now. But this is also evidence, like other minorities are treated extremely poorly, like Filipino people in Japan. But also historical evidence, like the fact Korean people lived in slums until the 1980s in Japan. The fact that Commodore Matthew Perry of the US Navy literally had to point a gun at Tokyo to force them to open up and trade as part of a Meiji restoration. Japan moves slow, Japan is xenophobic, this will be unpopular. Why is that important? Firstly, because the LDP is in a historically weak position politically at the moment for 3 reasons. Firstly, because of the retirement of Shinzo Abe, who, as I've noted, was extremely popular during his reign and was kind of formed the identity of the modern LDP. Secondly, because no leader has been able to take up the mantle of the LDP particularly effectively after the retirement of Shinzo Abe. Yasuda Yoshihide being forced to retire due to bungling the Olympics, bungling COVID, bungling losses at the local election. You have the current unpopular leader of Fumio Kishida struggling to make up and make amends or kind of lead to any improvement on any of those fronts. You have factionalization within the LDP being such a big and historically dominant party, which puts it in a historically weak position compared to earlier. But secondly, we'd also point out the assassination of Shinzo Abe, and this is critical, exposed the scandal which shook the party to its core, which was the Unification Church scandal, wherein a huge number of LDP leadership was connected to a single church, which is characterized as a cult by the media, where there was an outpouring of stories from the public saying that the Unification Church has screwed them over in the past, the Unification Church should be suspicious, and a huge number of people were connected to it. That explains why the LDP is in a weak position, and doing something so unpopular is not what we should do. But even if you don't believe that they're so weak they might lose an election, margins matter. The LDP is factionalized, meaning you can't count on every vote in every election. You need a safe margin of victory in order to govern responsibly. Because relative perceptions of mandates matter based on margins, especially when you're trying to, for instance, get the cooperation of courts or corporations or any other institution other than the parliament. Because failing to win by a substantial amount emboldens opposition, both from the left and right. As this thing says, you rely on things like coalitions across multiple parties. And finally, we point out that dominance is a huge upside for the LDP. They want to remain dominant. They want to be able to keep the Unification Church scandal under wraps. They want to be able to continue the legacy of Shinzo Abe. This team takes it away. But secondly, even if you don't buy any of that political stuff, the party would view this policy as an extremely bad idea. Why? 3 reasons. Firstly, it's an incredibly conservative party. It cares about sovereignty, it cares about putting Japan first, is xenophobic itself. Secondly, it is to be viewed as an abandonment of Abe, who supports things instead like childbirth, like urbanization, as we described. And notably, the evidence that Abe's legacy is the primary consideration of the LDP is extremely, extremely plentiful. They didn't move the Olympics despite a huge COVID risk because it was Abe's pet project. They've stood by Abenomics despite the fact it's leading to problems because of loyalty to Shinzo Abe. They've refused to kind of come to the negotiation table with South Korea and engage in reparation funds creation because of the legacy of Shinzo Abe. They care about this legacy. Shinzo Abe would never have engaged in such a policy. That is why the party itself would view it as a bad idea. But finally, we would also question whether this even makes good economic sense. That is, there is no lack of skilled labour in Japan or unskilled labour in Japan. Things like low inflation, things like low wage growth point to the fact that wages or labour isn't the input that's missing. Japan is doing fine. But we also point out that, for instance, other policies meet the exact needs, even if you believe that some labour could be used. Policies like automation, where Japan is already a leader. Things which would be far more popular with the corporate overloads that this team says are so important. That explains to you why, even if you don't believe that politics is number one, this would be viewed as a bad idea. And in particular, note that the party of the LDP has other objectives that it wants to achieve. That is, if it has political capital to burn, if you can do all the sorts of things this team says is so important, they would want to follow Abe's legacy. Do things like, as this team says, undoing constitutional amendments to allow things like demilitarization, to pursue the Japan First vision that the 4 founders of this party cared about. This is a debate about the LDP, where the side which steps into their shoes throughout to a close.
This opposition team wanted to counterprop something in this debate. It would have been much nicer rather than to just throw different ideas at the wall, but step through each individual claim. Because some of them just sound deeply improbable to me. Like, how do you automate your healthcare service to address your aging population? Bewildering. Some of them just seem totally synergistic with asset policies. They want to do tax decreases. You're going to be able to persuade businesses that you have a cohesive, unified narrative by also supporting those policies under our side. Why are these exclusive? No explanation. What we say is essential in this debate is there are always going to be other coalition partners that are trying to cater to business incentives as well. And this is one of those key metrics that businesses really care about that this LDP needs to address as well. I think the first and quickest way we win this debate is an explanation about why companies are indispensable in this about to just simply have to be catered to by the LDP through this sort of policy. And the inside opposition's responses are a little bit confusing here. The first is they see that there's a huge imperative to make sure that these companies are on side when they get up there and say that there's been a huge scandal with the church. What that means is a lot of these businesses are actually a little bit worried at the moment about whether their lobbying towards the LDP will come back to bite them or whether they'll get caught up in these types of scandals. So you need to reassure them by providing a set of policy that they care quite deeply about. But secondly, it's their current leader, of course, wants to change the narrative of that. It's just been a lingering problem that is perpetually causing issues, and as such, it is so convenient to shift the narrative back towards economics, which has historically been the LDP's stronghold, that they are good and responsible economic managers. This is their home turf, and this would be a policy shift that largely reassures businesses that the LDP is getting back to doing what it is good at doing. What is side opposition's responses? Twofold. Firstly, they say the low inflation environment means ... I'm not entirely sure here. I think there are two big problems with this argument. The first is, it is true that Japan historically has had significantly lower inflation, but that in the modern era, the high inflation rates in many other countries has very rapidly changed shape, and businesses have not been prepared in the slightest for it. The reason why our case is about chronic labour shortages is precisely because of the low inflation environment side opposition describes. These businesses have been conducting operations in an environment of relative labour oversupply for a long time now, and all of a sudden there is strict labour shortages as large numbers of people have decided to retire early from COVID, have shifted to the US from higher wages because the US is experiencing incredibly tight labour shortages. All of this suggests that the LDP just needs to give serious incentives to make these people come back, needs to do the type of policy that we described, of subsidising housing, providing faster citizenship pathways, of genuinely making visas easier to collect so more people are willing to sign up, or raising the quotas on those type of migrants. But it is secondly because, as they described, there's been a low inflation environment, and the Japanese central bank's response to that has been enormous sets of economic stimulus, like pouring trillions of dollars into the Japanese economy. And guess what effect that has had? These Japanese companies have rapidly been expanding as fast as possible, which has fueled the very labour shortage that we described. Like, our mechanisms and their case go hand in hand. They're like proving our case. I was kind of confused by this analysis. And as such, I think what that concretely proves to you is that given the actual structural reasons why there's a chronic labour shortage in Japan, and as such why this policy uniquely at this point in time is explicitly essential. And the impacting of this is really simple. It's in two dimensions. The first is that these companies provide essential finances for the LDP. Genuinely, these companies just provide a tiny bit less money to some other coalition competitor instead. That is the expensive advertising campaigns across the nation that the LDP can no longer afford. But perhaps more concretely than that, is that these companies employ millions of workers, and their endorsement, a proud endorsement to get their workers to support the LDP, is often the tipping point of elections in very substantial and significant ways. Because Japan, uniquely, has the lowest or the greatest amount of worker loyalty out of any country in the world. Japanese workers transition to other workplaces less than in any other country because they have enormous promotion pathways, which means that those workers are uniquely tied to their workplaces. As such, when workplaces are more aligned with the LDP and more satisfied with their economic policy, they're more likely to give this endorsement to ensure that these workers genuinely follow suit and vote for the LDP. But second, is even if you don't believe that we've already won the debate of economic analysis explaining why we get companies with Zaibatsu on side, I think the public more broadly doesn't fall to them anywhere near as clearly as they make out. Because yes, there are many conservatives that are a little bit xenophobic because of the homogeneity in Japan at the moment, but that does not mean that they are explicitly vehemently opposed to this policy in the way that side opposition describes. I'm sorry, but they just see South Korean doctors helping their grandmother all the time. They just see US engineering staff working alongside them through partnerships every single day. I just don't think this is the type of population that is exposed to the type of immigrants that they describe that is now likely to be vehemently opposed to this type of policy. I think there's three reasons for this. The first, and in direct response to their analysis of why China is uniquely xenophobic, I think there are two reasons why their analysis is a bit untrue. Firstly, it is, they say, there are very few successful sets of immigrants. The vast majority of them end up in slums. There are not many success stories. Actually, the opposite is true. Because Japan has had historically very low sets of immigration, the types of individuals that have decided to travel to Japan overwhelmingly have been some of the most wealthy individuals that feel like they had some of the greatest chances of success. These are the individuals that arrived in Japan through Western partnerships at Japanese universities. These are individuals that transferred from South Korea to Japan for the prospects of those high wages that had a relatively high degree of skills to break into that market. We think these are the types of people who actually do provide the success stories, not the inverse the side opposition describes. Their second argument is on education. And this argument is true to some extent, but I think the education more explicitly encourages Japanese students to be nationalistic. That is, they tend to care a large amount about their country, the pride of that country. The problem with side opposition is that nationalism does not directly tie to xenophobia in the way that they describe. Because, psychologically, I think a really useful example for this is Brexit. Because obviously people in Britain really cared about the decline of Britain, and the question is who they blamed it on. And they blamed it on a series of immigrant communities because that was a very high percentage of the population. They're a very visible group to point that finger at. In Japan, that doesn't exist. They experienced this period of humiliation, but didn't have this high degree of immigrant labour that had displaced large amounts of workers. And as such, the nationalistic rhetoric out of Japan doesn't have the same xenophobic tinge that it does in other countries like in Italy or the UK. What that means uniquely is that a series of conservatives in Japan actually quite specifically support a policy of increasing immigration, but are actually still quite conservative and quite nationalistic on the ground. And that's for the reasons that Ella already explained to you. That when you are faced this type of humiliation, when your country has been labelled a declining country with severe ageing population, yes, of course they support fertility increases, but those policies have been almost entirely ineffectual. They've done almost nothing. Japan still has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. What actually reached to the hearts of the people on the ground was an explanation of our economy is recovering. That genuinely our workforce participation as women have poured into the workforce, as we've gotten more skilled immigrants, has recovered, that our growth in particular has turned around. And what that means is to the type of the public that side opposition describes, and they care much more about our economic benefits than about the xenophobia that they describe. Last, even if you didn't believe all of that, I just think the vast majority of the types of extra immigrants that we get under our side are not some of the most offensive individuals that people are going to be the most aggrieved about, even if they are particularly xenophobic. Because they say, who would travel from the developed world to another developing country? Like we're in both Australian teams, right? This is a very, very common occurrence for the very set of incentives that we give in this debate. So, the vast majority of these people, even if they are relatively xenophobic, are unlikely to vote by actually changing their vote, and as such, our arguments are just far more important.
fighting uphill because their policy flies in the face of racism, nationalism, and xenophobia that is the status quo in Japan. That is the revealed preference of the LDP, of Japanese citizens, of one of the most racially homogenous countries in the rich world. They are pushing against that, and they need to do far better than they have done so far. The first thing I'm going to explain in this speech is that from the LDP's perspective, this is simply a bad and economically unsound policy in a number of respects, both because of its actual cost and its opportunity cost. And this will explain why, even before I get into how this policy is perceived by the public, you should intuit that it is unpopular simply because it is bad. That is because, not only from the perspective of the people who are high up within this party, who are conservative and nationalist, they don't like it, people who are beholden to Abe's legacy, generally, but also particularly with regard to the Abe's position of improving the birth rate over resorting to open migration. But also because they are economically self-interested, and this is not a good economic idea. Unskilled foreign labour does not fix Japan's economy. And their claim at Second Affirmative is like, maybe things were different in the past, but now with COVID we have a labour shortage. That does not explain why you need, for instance, skilled labour to fix that. They do not explain why you fix the problems of COVID, which is not necessarily a problem of a labour shortage. But importantly, the concession they make, which is inflation was low historically, concedes that migration was not part of Abenomics before, and that indicates that their claim about what the precedent is very unlikely to be true. But importantly, our claim, which they misunderstand, right, is that low inflation concedes that labour is not in demand because otherwise it would have bid up the price. And a lot of their analysis suggests that the economic harms they point to would not be remedied by open migration. For instance, they say that there's strong workplace loyalty that indicates people are not leaving their workplaces. The things that you are changing are not getting in more skilled labour. We think often you're dealing in highly automated industries where you do not need to get that kind of migration to remedy their problems. We point out various alternative pathways to strengthening the LDP, which this affirmative team necessarily foregoes because their policy is extremely expensive. They need to do resettlement programs. They need to deal with citizens who are very angry. They need to provide more housing for people. They need to deal with language programs and welfare, etc. We would instead spend all that money and political capital on things like childcare benefits, which encourage people to have more children, things like automation to help the elderly. And they just assert that we've done those things already and they haven't worked. No, you haven't. Japan has, for instance, incredibly sexist custody and divorce laws that impoverish women and prevent them from joining the workplace or push them out of the workplace. If you got rid of those things, you would increase the workforce participation of women, which is one reason why Japan is in a bad economic situation at the moment. But even if we're not improving the economy, there are also just other ways to strengthen the LDP's image, for instance, by increased militarism. And these guys say, well, you need more people for that. You actually don't. You need to, for instance, reallocate people from the army to the navy. Like, that's the personnel problem. And you do that via political capital, not by numbers of people within your state. And much more importantly, you need the money to keep on increasing the military budget, which was the proposal of Abe, and which is the thing that this government wants to continue. We would do that instead. That is how we would get power. This is a bad policy economically. This is a bad policy in terms of opportunity cost. And this team's benefits basically stop at university placements and visas. Those things, if they are good, we can do as well. That is not about migration. They need to defend extremely costly policies of bringing new people into your state, which are costly not only for governments who have to do more things like welfare, but also for citizens whose wages often do in fact go down, whose costs of housing and costs of living go up. Secondly, this is an enormously unpopular policy, so we win the debate a second time over. Their only response to all of Daniel's extremely detailed and dense analysis about why Japan is highly nationalist, about why that is important to the LDP's success, and about why that nationalism is incredibly robust, is to say, well, if you're nationalist, that means you want to do what's good for Japan. And what is good for Japan is letting in more people. I've already disproven that premise, but clearly people are not rational in the way they describe. Nationalism is not people doing what is actually good for their country. It is going along, extremely irrational views like racism, extremely irrational views like groupthink. But secondly, they just assert that migrants will be successful. A great deal of their reasoning from that speech, I'll note, is circular. They say migrants and minorities do really well, therefore they provide good examples of minorities doing well so people like them. They need to prove that first premise first, and they do not. We prove the inverse, which is of course you don't get skilled labour. Of course you don't get people who are economically contributing, because why do they want to come to Japan when they could have good wages in their own country and a culture that is familiar to them? But importantly, their best case only works retrospectively, right? Maybe in 10 years you get some successful waves of migration. By that time, the LDP, which both teams concede is in a weak position at the moment, is already voted out, or is already in the grips of factionalism, already has less power to govern effectively, already has emboldened opposition parties to get stronger into the future. Even if wants now before the next election? How do they attempt to overcome the extremely intuitive claim of side negative, which is that Japan is pretty racially homogenous, it doesn't like migration? They have a few attempts, none of which have survived. The first claim they make is about companies, and I want to note how many premises you need to believe in order to credit this argument. The first is that Japanese companies want workers more than they dislike migration. The second is that they will punish the LDP electorally if they do not get those workers. And the third is that that punishment will hurt the LDP. None of those premises survive. To the first, companies are often highly nationalist themselves. See, for instance, the connection of Hyundai to Japan-Korea relations, particularly high-ranked executives who are close with government officials. It is not the case that those companies are always totally driven by their bottom line. Obviously, that is an important factor for those companies, but a lot of the time, important nationalist companies do have that nationalist sentiment. But secondly, they're not going to punish the LDP if they don't get what they want, because even if they value labour, they value the LDP in power because they benefit from its conservative tax policy. But secondly, the LDP itself is able to punish Toyota and punish Hyundai by removing that tax policy, for instance, especially as the second affirmative concedes, if they are anxious about their own involvement, that is the company's own involvement, with scandals. But thirdly, even if they punish the LDP by removing a little bit of money for advertisements, that does not hurt its electoral success, because you win elections via votes. Many, many people do not want their wages to go down, do not want foreigners in their country, and they believe those things will happen. You want party control, which allows you good governments. And importantly, other lobbies exist which don't want skilled labour. They're not describing all businesses. That argument is out. Secondly, on popularity, they say, well, you're going to get good migrants coming in, or migrants that people like, skilled South Koreans, Canadian engineers, and doctors. One, just note how afactual this is. Japan is incredibly hostile to South Koreans. Look at, for instance, the Japan First Party. Look at, for instance, local hate groups against South Koreans within that nation. The fact that this is a very culturally homogenous place to live, even if, for instance, you don't experience active racism, why would people leave their lives in their own country? Particularly if you are coming from a rich country where you could get both good wages and a familiar culture. But even if they get some skilled workers, they get way more people from poorer and neighbouring states. They get way more people from the Philippines who cannot remedy the labour crisis and who put massive costs on the government which people don't like. The final claim they make is, well, people care about the economy and they care about old people. One, we don't make a trade-off. We are able to improve the economy, improve elderly welfare in other ways, and do that in ways that people respond to effectively. But secondly, conservatism is not subservient to economic self-interest. Note, as I explained before, the failure to reform sexist child support and divorce laws, even though those things prevent women from contributing to the economy, because that conservatism is so ingrained. But importantly, finally, their claim again about migrants being rich and powerful is simply afactual. Migrants face enormous discrimination in Japan, particularly if you're considering waves of migration over the past 50 years. It is terrible for those individuals because there is such strong nationalism, there is such strong conservatism. We instead would remedy economic problems in other ways, and even if you believe they get a slight edge on the economy, that does not secure the LDP's interests. Only side negative can do that.
team's effort to win this debate relies on a series of factual claims that are lies. I implore you, panel, for the sake of the integrity of this activity, you cannot give this debate to a team that is so incorrect. 2 questions. Getting MNCs on side. Secondly, is this policy popular? Firstly, on getting MNCs on side, their first claim is that there is no labour shortage in Japan. Guys, we have to do something about lying and debating. First of all, are there intelligent photo knowledge? Secondly, the mechanism we give you why there is a labour shortage is incredibly intuitive and you should just believe it. That is, there is an ageing population in Japan. As people retire, they leave the workforce. That means the size of the economy is disproportionately large relative to the size of the labour pool, which means that there are fewer people who take on the jobs required to support the economy that facilitates all those people. That is not a complicated premise. It's one that relies on first principles and it's one that you should accept. Thirdly, we explained to you that not only due to the ageing population that already exists, but this has been compounded by COVID. Because when people saw that COVID happened, they lent on their retirement savings, they chose not to work during a period which was already unpleasant for them, which meant that people retired early. And I would note this is important for impacting here, because the set of people that retired during COVID were the most skilled people at the peak of their professions who were most integral to these companies, which suggests to you that yes, there is a high skilled labour shortage in Japan. Their claim in response to this is that, well, there is high inflation and low inflation and low wage growth, but there are so many other economic factors than just the number of jobs in a market that affect these 2 things, and they give you no structural reason to explain why that is the most likely proof for why there is no labour shortage. It is also just unclear that people just aren't accepting these high-paying jobs to explain why there is no inflation. That proves to you that there is a labour shortage, which explains the imperative for MNCs to support the LDP. The second claim then, as well, it's unlikely to be high-skilled labour, it's far more likely to be low-skilled labour. This is stupid, it goes against all the ways countries around the world already do migration. That's the first thing, because there are easy ways to make high-skilled labour workforces come to your country. There's things like structuring it into your visa application process so you accept more high-skilled people with higher credentials with more education than low-skilled people. But secondly, it's through things like giving them high incentives to come to your country. That's like giving out housing. That's like things like they do in Europe, where they give you a period of 5 years where you get a slightly lower tax rate. All of those things are able to incredibly encourage high-skilled workforces to come to Japan. And I would note, the proof for this that you need is that in Japan right now, prior to doing these kinds of policies, there are months-long, years-long waits towards getting visas in Japan, huge queues, which suggest to you that lots of people do actually want to move towards Japan. But secondly, we explained to you that companies, because they are so desperate, because of what was previously proven, are willing to offer insanely high paychecks to get high-skilled people, which gives high-skilled labourers from other economies the imperative to come towards Japan. Because that is an economy where these corporations are desperate, where they are willing to give out higher paychecks than they would get in other countries, and that is the incentive that draws them towards Japan, bringing high-skilled labour forces to the country. Third claim they make then as well, there are other things we can do, like support automation, like support tax breaks. The first issue with this is lots of it just doesn't fix the high-skilled labour shortage. You can automate building a car, but you cannot automate designing that car. That's why Hyundai and Mitsubishi want high-skilled labourers and not just a higher birth rate. But secondly, we can do all of these things as well in addition. It just improves the incentive for companies who are willing to go on our side. But thirdly, many of their mechanisms are just far too slow. Their example, as a counter-example, is fertility. That takes 25 fucking years for them to enter the workforce properly, and then for them to actually become a high-skilled labourer takes another 50 years, increasing the workforce by nothing. But even if it did, the birth rate is 1.2 in Japan, far below the replacement rate, which means even if you massively increase the fucking aphrodisiacs in the water supply, you're not going to sufficiently increase it. Now, let's address the set of rebuttal that Sophie explains in response to this. Her first claim is companies are racist too. First problem, we explained such a high substantial imperative, I just think it should overcome this. I would also note that people who are highly educated, who work at the peak of these companies, are less likely to be racist than the average Japanese citizen. But secondly, because they are competing internationally, there is just a high demand and respect for other countries and other countries' workforces and corporations so you can gain a competitive edge as well. Her second piece of rebuttal as well, companies will stay with the LDP to support their tax policy. This claim misunderstands the political landscape of Japan because the LDP is not the only conservative party, it is one of many, which means that there are alternative parties that these companies could support. And supporting these other parties instead of the LDP is killer for this party because they are their key competition, which means if they have more money, they dominate more of the media cycle, and they become more successful at the expense of the voter base which otherwise would have gone towards the LDP. Her third piece of rebuttal then as well. Money doesn't win elections, votes do. The issue with this is money often wins votes. That's why in almost every political landscape around the world, the party which received more funding is the same party that won that election. It's because of the mechanisms we gave Bella to no direct response. That number one, you can fund advertising, you can fund staffers to do campaigning on the ground, increasing your presence, increasing the incentive for voters to know about you. Secondly, companies, which we would get on side, have huge lobbying power over media corporations, so in addition to having more advertising, you're also able to dominate the media cycle itself and get more in the news. Thirdly, it's because workers who work at these corporations, because of the workplace culture that exists in Japan, are loyal towards their workplace, which means they're likely to side the same political party that their workplace endorses. What does the argument do? Firstly, it substantially raises the bar for side negative, because they need to explain to us why you would massively sacrifice a pool of funding, and not only lose that pool of funding, but give it to a different political party, which is competing for the same pool of voters as you are, and give them that advantage. And secondly, therefore construct an entirely independent win strategy for our team, because even if you believe this policy is unpopular, it allows us to have that unpopular policy and still win elections more, because we get our popular policies in the news, we are able to construct narratives around what this election is actually about, and dissuade from policies that are unpopular. Second question then, is this popular? And I think we win this back quite clearly as well. Their first claim here, well, Japan is racist. I think this is really just a question of weighing. Japan is a little bit racist. How do we get over that bar? First thing, we explained to you this is a continuation of Abenomics. Dan said he didn't do this, he did other stuff. First of all, again, please stop lying. But secondly, we just explained to you that he did those things. Yes, he increased the birth rate. Yes, he increased funding. He did, in addition to that, an increase in migration. There is no reason why just because he did that set of things, he didn't also do this set of things. But secondly, we give you good structural reasons to suggest why he did that. That's firstly, because we explained it's good for economic growth. But secondly, the mechanisms we provided you for corporate capture also explain why Abe was likely to have done this as well. Because even Abe had that corporate capture, it suggests he had the same incentive as the party does now to continue to support high levels of immigration, a structural reason if you don't believe the actual fact of the matter. The second reason we prove then that this is good is that it is an extension of nationalism. So if he says nationalism is about irrational stuff like racism, this is unnuanced. It misunderstands what nationalism looks like in Japan. Nationalism in Japan is about honor, it's about pride, it's about how you look in the international stage, not domestically, not internally, not hating on immigrants, which you don't even know about because there are very low levels of immigration for the country. And we explain to you, this massively increases your potential for economic growth, and it can easily be pitched as such to voters. Because voters are acutely aware of this worker shortage that exists in Japan. Because all the voters have grandparents that they want to put into aged care, but cannot, because aged care is too expensive because there are such a small pool of workers with the capacity to work in aged care. Because voters are aware of their corporations' desires because of their loyalty, and because their corporations have specific delegates that go and speak to government, which means they are making constant public statements about how they endorse, about which party they prefer, which means they are acutely aware of what their company prefers. And if their company says that this is good for economic growth, it will be good for that company, then they believe it's good for the country, because they believe in that economic growth and believe in that power. And the third issue with this, and the way that we outweigh it, is I just think they exaggerate the extent to which Japan is racist. Because yes, Japan dislikes certain sets of people. It is a problematic country, but it is expanding. Increased access to the internet, increased access to other people, means that Japanese people are not the insane ideological idiots that this team thinks that they are. They do have the capacity to understand that a high-skilled labourer from a different country can be good, can be effective. I just think we clearly take this debate, do not let a team that lies as much as this one progress to the grand final.
Shinzo Abe did not just lead the LDP, he built the LDP. He revived it after its first ever loss, after 50 years in power in 2008, and he brought it back into power. He set its vision. He was the LDP. And that is why at any point in time, at any juncture, whenever the LDP wonders what it should do, the question it always asks is what would Abe do? And what he would not do is the policy of this affirmative team. I'm going to win this debate in 3 ways. Firstly, I'll prove that it's clearly contrary to the interests of the party, which is clearly the most important question of the debate, because what the actor wants should determine what the actor does. Secondly, I'll explain that since there is no labour shortage, this policy by this team's own metric would not make sense because it would not appease voters, it would not appease companies. And finally, I'll explain why even if none of that is true, the harms outweigh the benefits. So, why is this very clearly against the interests of the LDP? First premise here is to just explain that Abe's legacy is clearly the most important thing in the eyes of the LDP. It's very easy to do it. You can just look to things that the average person does know about Japan. For example, the fact that despite being extremely unpopular, Suga Yoshihide felt the need to go ahead with the Tokyo Olympics, felt the need to allow millions of people into the country to visit the game, to increase the risk of COVID spreading, explicitly because it was a pet project of Shinzo Abe, and he could not think of possibly abandoning it. The fact that, for example, the Bank of Japan still engages in a policy of yield control in an environment that is no longer appropriate for it, because that was a key plank of Abenomics. The fact that, for example, the current Prime Minister of Japan, Fumio Kishida, feels unable to agree with Yoon Suk-yeol about reparations for forced labour because it is not what Abe would do. At every point in time, even when it was in the interest of the party, they prioritised what Abe would do, or every single time over any other consideration. Which is why, if you believe that Abe would not support this policy, you ought to believe that neither should the LDP now. Why is it clear that Abenomics would be opposed to this particular idea? This team does heavy lifting here when Eugene concedes a second affirmative that, for example, traditionally Japan has had a low labour oversupply and low inflation, and that the problem they identified is in fact very recent. Because that explains to you that a piece of economic policy that has existed for well over a decade obviously would be designed around the conditions at the time it was incepted and not the time that is now, which is to say Abenomics was designed to include things like stimulus, was designed around an excess of labour, which explicitly this team concedes. But secondly, we point out that the features of the Japanese labour market that the average reasonable person would know, things like long hours, things like the need to be seen to be working even when there's nothing to do, things like the lack of promotions, things like the poor working conditions, indicate a country that has too much labour, not too little. Because if there was too little, those workers would be able to bargain for better conditions. Those workers would be able to bargain for better pay. Those workers would be getting quickly promoted. Clearly, all of this indicates a country in which there was an excess of labour. And what this means is that, at best for this team, maybe you believe them when they say that at the moment there is a shortage of labour. You ought not believe that it's historically true, literally because they conceded. You therefore ought believe that Abenomics does not say migration is good. You would not support migration at a time when you get too much labour and not too little. And obviously this must prove that this team contradicts the key interests of the actor. If you're doing what Abe would do, you ought not do this. But secondly, even if you don't believe that is the most important question of the debate, I will now address whether a shortage actually exists. Because if you believe that a shortage does not exist right now, it undermines their claims as to why companies would want migration, it undermines their claims as to why voters would get on board with migration, and it explains why this policy would be a loser with every single person involved. The reasons we tell you down the bench. The xenophobia, the fact that obviously they would be opposed to this. What do we explain as to why there is not? What reasons do they give you to believe that a shortage currently exists? Firstly, they say there is an aging population. That is true, but we point out this is not new. Japan's population has been aging for a very long time. Why does that create a recent problem that they concede did not exist 5 years ago, did not exist 10 years ago? They can't explain that. Secondly, we say that the aging population's problem has already been addressed by things like increasing automation, by things like higher levels of education that increase per worker productivity, so you can do more with fewer workers, by things like urbanization that means you can have more people coming into the cities and doing the jobs that are needed, even as rural populations decline, because you don't need those rural populations. But thirdly, we point out that Abe has already addressed the issue of aging populations with other policies. Things like getting people to have more kids, things like better childcare laws, things like attempting to shift norms around things like that, which explain exactly why, and AFT concedes that these policies do exist. It's very likely that the issue of the aging population would not suddenly kick in now and cause a problem. If anything, the birth rate sticks up over time, which suggests that it's unclear why there'd be a labour shortage now. The second reason is just to say that COVID has caused a large number of premature retirements. This does not make sense for several reasons. Firstly, it's counterintuitive. COVID made people poorer, not richer. It means it's more likely to delay retirement rather than move forward. Secondly, we point out this is a one-time hit and doesn't explain the need for structural realignment in the way that the country operates, i.e. some people retiring now would obviously be replaced by new people who, for example, enter the workforce, and over time the economy will be able to adjust. But thirdly, we point out that Japan is famous for very late retirements. It's very unlikely people retire because the culture is around working as long as you possibly can. Working is seen as culturally valuable, is seen as a way that you contribute, so it seems unlikely people would just decide to up and leave. Fourthly, explicitly for the reasons that benefits tend to be tied to employment, and so, for example, things like pensions cannot just have you leave at a random time. You need to work out for a sufficient amount of time to get those things. No explanation as to why it would be possible for workers to leave prematurely before they would normally retire, which is what you must believe in this team's claim that suddenly there are less workers than there were before to be true. It can't just be regular forms of retirement that would otherwise occur. Which means, and lastly, even if you believe none of that, we just explained they wouldn't get skilled labour on their side from their policy. Why is that true? One, it explains you huge amounts of xenophobia that mean it's an unattractive location to move to. Secondly, even if you don't believe that, there are at least very substantial cultural differences from the other countries that they want to claim migrants come from, like the US, like Canada, like Australia. Obviously, it'd be a very large shift. We point out that Japan traditionally has had substantially lower wages than other places, so it doesn't make sense they'd be able to attract skilled candidates from those particular countries. The long-run impact of this means that it's just unclear how at all could believe that there was a labour shortage. If you don't believe that this labour shortage exists, this team loses on their own metric, because companies wouldn't want more labour when there's not a shortage, and voters would not want it when it means downward pressure on their jobs, when it means more competition, when it leads less promotions. But finally, even if you believe none of that, win the debate for a final time just by proving, even if there was a labour shortage, this policy would be so unpopular that it would never swing with voters. Why? What reasons do they give you to say that it would be popular? Firstly, they say rich minorities have succeeded, so everyone loves minorities in Japan. One, we point out this is asserted. Two, we point out it's circular. They just say, well, minorities can succeed now because they succeeded in the past. No explanation as to why that happened. And three, contrary to all of the evidence we point to, the fact that Koreans lived in slums until 1980, the fact that indigenous groups are treated poorly, the fact that Japan is just a xenophobic country. The second reason they give you is just say people accept it because there's an undersupply and they're pragmatic. We point out firstly this is contingent on previous argument, you ought not believe it. Secondly, even if it were true that an undersupply existed, they don't explain why voters would engage in a pragmatic way. Why they wouldn't weigh all of the reasons we give you, particularly when they tell you that companies are crying out and they bring in huge amounts of additional labour, why voters would tolerate it, despite the xenophobia, despite the nationalism, despite the education system that tells you that those things are bad, despite the media landscape that says you ought not engage in large amounts of immigration, and all the empirical examples we give you down the bench. And even if you believe this team's claim that things are changing, we explain change occurs slowly in Japan. That is why, for example, business is still a boys' club. That is why, for example, women in 2023 are still expected to tend to the home and do all of that kind of labour, when in other countries, none of those things are true. Japan operates very differently from Western countries. Don't let them convince you that none of those things are true. And this explains why, even if you believe that maybe companies like this, if voters don't, it's a simple mechanism to not piss off voters than to, get companies on side and use their money to maybe get the pissed off voters to vote for you again. Obviously, you should just side with us here. At the end of this debate, us begs you to believe them. We actually prove why you should believe us. We give you mechanisms. We don't just make up claims. This is not what Abe would do. It is not what you should do.
First on legacy, second on legitimacy. Let's start with legacy. This is the argument that wins us the debate, because it is the most important for two key reasons. The first is it does not rely on where you fall on the various battles economically. That is, it does not matter if you think skilled labour is important. It does not matter if you think unskilled or skilled labour would be the majority of the people who arrive in this country. Legacy cuts above. The question, what would Abe do, does not rely on the answer to that question. But secondly, we point out the context of uncertainty, which both teams indicate is present, is a reason to think that legacy is number one. Because in times of crisis, Abe is who saved the LPD, and it's a reason to think in this time of crisis, if you believe there is one, as this team tries to convince you there is, they return to Abe's legacy again. Let's start here. We explain a very simple thing. The LPD's maxim is what would Abe do, and the Abe would not listen to this team. we proved two important things. The first thing we proved is that upholding his legacy is clearly the #1 priority of the LPD for two reasons. The first is the range of examples which this team cannot answer for, which indicate that the LPD has a strong bias to upholding Abe's legacy, even if there are other concerns which might indicate that's a bad idea. That is the Olympics, that is Abenomics and Eurocontrol, that is the military, that is its relationship with South Korea. No answer from this team. But secondly, we also proved it structurally. We explained that Abe built the modern identity of the LPD, resurrected it from its first defeat 50 years. We explained that Abe was extremely popular during his reign and wrote the political playbook for the party. And we explained that he was deeply ingrained with party leadership personally through institutions like the Unification Church. No response to any of that, and it's clearly the issue which cuts above everything else, because it avoids the mire and the uncertainty of any other issue in this debate. But secondly, we also showed that this team certainly violates that commitment to Abe's legacy in three ways. Firstly, because their own analysis implies it. If economic conditions have changed substantially, that implies that Abenomics and Abe's legacy would not do what this team thinks is necessary. Maybe before accusing your mates of lying, do your homework first. But secondly, we explained that this is in direct contrast with other elements of Japan first approach. That is native population growth. That is making more efficient use of Japanese people through things like automation, things like urbanization. And thirdly, we explained the ethnic nationalism that we say is likely, rather than this general amorphous nationalism, which this team says is the case, fits much better with the trend of other policies which Abe's legacy has led to. Things like militarization, which doesn't exactly go hand in hand with expanding migration. This is the issue which is the clearest in the debate. It's the issue you should vote on alone. But secondly, we also win the question of legitimacy on political outcomes. Because firstly, does the LPD think this is a good idea? They need to win that conclusively, and it's unclear. We point out that this makes very little economic sense. Skilled labour is plentiful, that's why there's low inflation, low wage growth, and tough labour conditions. And they help us out here when they say that workers are very loyal to their company and are unable to leave. But we also explain that even if there is a shortage, this team is unlikely to get very many more of those people than we are. Because we explain that things like visas and education programs are obviously symmetric, and there are huge push factors to permanent migration, which is the difference between the two things. Things like a fraught relationship with neighbours like South Korea and China, things like cultural idiosyncrasies which push Westerners away. And secondly, we also show that a wealth of alternatives exist, whether they be through urbanization or automation, to solve this very problem in a way which doesn't endanger the legacy which we say is so important. But secondly, we also show that the public is unlikely to think this is a good idea, even if the party does. We demonstrate that the public is extremely xenophobic, which they at best mitigate, but beyond that, we show that the progress is slow, even where there are trends towards more liberalization. We explain that this is also, that this unpopularity is very concrete in the way that it is projected through the media, so on and so forth. And finally, we also outweigh any material on multinational corporations, which is clearly contingent, firstly, on this making economic sense, secondly, on proving that there's another party that these MNCs could align with, which they don't prove, and because of the fact that this team can never answer the question of even if the LPD can kind of placate these companies in a number of ways, why the ones which we can't also support, things like lowering taxes, things like helping with automation, can't get them across the line. This team hangs their hat on one benefit and they don't prove it. Round of applause.
Abe is rolling in his grave right now because you know what he actually cared about? He cared about a strong Japan, he cared about a thriving Japan, he cared about an economically prosperous Japan. He cared about economic growth, he cared about corporate capture. We are able to bring you both of those things through a policy that is just neatly aligned with what he did in 2015 and 16. What is the impact of people coming? Who comes and why do they come? What is the impact of them coming? Because even if you believe that the popularity of this policy is a wash, you must believe the most important thing in this debate is the impact on the economy and the ability to appease MNCs. Because these two things are the most directly connected and vital to the success success of the LDP. And I think it's indicative that Daniel only gets to that at 3 minutes and 50 of his reply. They just cannot win this issue, because their whole case is based around fulfilling the principles of Abe Nomes. Maybe Abe moderately increased immigration because he was worried about the Asian population. Maybe he opposed increased migration for economic conditions at the time. But the truth is that he did moderately increase migration. Obviously, not to the extent that we are supporting, but it is consistent principally with what he did. And the reason why he did both migration and fertility is because of the long wait time on fertility, as we tell you at Charlie. So it is just mechanistically true that he did in fact do both. And this is just an extension of that stance, particularly given that Japan is facing new struggles now than they ever did, like a skills shortage and like inflation. And what would Abe do? He would care about a healthy Japan, and he would care about Japan being quote-unquote in the green. We tell you that the West is an important stakeholder for the LDP to appease. The most important stakeholder in this debate is MNCs. Because for all negative wants to talk about lowering corporate tax rates and subsidising companies, it does not matter, because the MNCs have a revealed preference for labour. That is obviously what they want. As they said, they are desperate for it. And in turn, they are able to do things like increase their level of wages to encourage people to come. They are able to do things like increase the economy, which in turn directly benefits the LDP. They are able to do things like get their workers to vote for the LDP at the point where they appease them. Obviously, the other option is that they give their funding to a different Conservative party. We don't need a mechanism to tell you that there's another Conservative party. It's a fucking democracy. There's obviously another Conservative party, and that is where that money goes to otherwise. Why do they come? 3 reasons we'll tell you down the bench. The government gives them incentives. People always want to move countries. It is not true that there's no incentive. Second of all, companies offer them proportionately far higher wages. Finally, Japan is just a very desirable place to live. Obviously, there is racism. That is the only reason why people do not want to go live in it at all. Finally, who comes? Because this whole negatives team's case has been so deeply uncharitable to the demographic of people that we're able to claim on our side. Because even if we get some low-skilled workers, who cares? They can work in the aged care facilities that are crying out for extra individuals to do things like tend to elder people in their bed, to do things like feed them and clothe them and make their families feel like they are supported in the dying minutes of their life. That is just an empirical truth of the status quo. And we are the only team that is ever able to feel that massive burden and gap that the LDP is constantly being shunned about because they are not doing anything to fix the problem. But we also tell you continually down the bench, there are so clearly incentives for high skilled workers who want to come. It is so clearly the preference of so many MNCs to be able to get those high skilled engineers. I implore you to look at the first 60 seconds of my 1A, where I specifically tell you that that is what they are after, and that is who is going to come. This negative team loses this debate because they never contend with our material about MNCs. They never explain why MNC is not the most important stakeholder in the debate, as we have been pushing down the bench this entire time. So proud for you as you want to win.
That go okay, you think?